Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. If you feel like you're wasting time and money with your current business software or just want to know what you could be missing, then you'll need to join the millions of others who have switched to Odoo. Odoo is the affordable, all-in-one management software with a library of fully integrated business applications that help you get more done in less time for a fraction of the price. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday. Odoo, modern management made simple. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, April 2nd, 1863, the Richmond Bread Riot, which took place in the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. On this day, it was the largest and most destructive in a series of civil disturbances throughout the South during the third spring of the American Civil War. The Bread Riot was, as you can probably guess from the name, largely about food supplies. Even as the capital of the South, Richmond was in really rough shape by this point. Conditions for the poor and working class in the city were deteriorating as the war dragged on. There are tons of fascinating details to this incident, which only lasted a few hours, the riot itself, but ended up in mass arrests and symbolized a real morale blow for the South. One of the most fascinating details I'll throw out right now is that this riot was largely led by the Women of Richmond. So let's talk about the 1863 Richmond Bread Riot. Here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
This larger picture, I think, is worth painting. We've hinted at it a couple times, but the real grinding conditions and deteriorating conditions for the South during the war. Kellie, do you want to kind of give a sense of that?
Yeah. I mean, what is it? War is hell?
Yeah.
That's exactly what this is. I think there's a couple contextual things that help sort of frame out why this bread riot happened. One, I think, is intense population growth. Richmond becomes one of the largest cities in the South. The South was not known for having big, vibrant cities like a Philadelphia or New York or Boston. Richmond was that sort of that capital city. And because they're sort of like the heart of the war, the Union has these blockades. They're keeping ships from coming into port. All of the people that would have been farming these lands are also fighting in the war. And the Confederacy is basically seizing land, seizing food, seizing enslaved people. And it makes it so that there is this tight sort of restriction on all resources. And that really comes to a blow when people don't have enough to eat.
Yeah.
Right. And this is a consequence of total war, which the U.S. Civil War is one of the progenitors of what we'll see in the 20th century with total war. But for civilians, life is not just turned upside down, but it is turned into real immiseration and poverty and a lack of resources. And it's not that kind of like Wheatless Wednesday thing that you see during World War I. It's like there's no wheat because nobody's planting the wheat because everything is going to the war effort. And what wheat you did manage to grow, well, that's going to go feed the soldiers. And the soldiers don't actually have enough food and the civilians don't have enough food. And by 1863, people are reaching a breaking point.
Yeah. It's interesting because, you know, the end of 1862, the victory at Fredericksburg, often sort of thought of as perhaps a high watermark for the Confederacy in terms of the war, but in terms of material conditions for citizens of the Confederacy, what we just described, I mean, inflation is also a huge issue here. Prices in 1863 were almost 10 times higher than they were in 1861. And then obviously plummeting morale, the Emancipation Proclamation is kind of creating some doubt. So it's just this combination of material conditions on the ground combined with the sort of sense of how is this war going to actually shake out.
And the climate too. I mean, Virginia gets snow, like significant snow. And that makes people miserable. And then spring comes and it's muddier than usual. And it makes transportation and bringing sort of like carts into the city even more difficult. It is unbearable on all fronts.
And so we did an episode last year about Jefferson Davis on March 27th, so just before this, calling for a day of fasting and prayer. And that is, you know, largely a result of many of these same conditions. Also a really interesting dynamic of sort of interweaving religious life, with economic life. But the day of fasting and prayer, at least for the citizens of Richmond, doesn't really doesn't really sustain them, so to speak. It's just.
Are you saying that it's a bad idea to ask starving people to fast?
To fast.
But pray. Thoughts and prayers are important too.
Yes. Look.
But
this time you're fasting for a purpose. It's not just that you don't have food. It's for Jesus.
Yeah.
So here we come to just a few days later, early April, the first few days of April, and things come to a head in Richmond. So let's go to Richmond itself and talk about these bread riots. And yes, that many of the people who were kind of agitating the most in these moments were the women of Richmond. So why is it that the women of Richmond are the ones who start to push back against the conditions?
Well, a big part of it is that women are in charge of the food, primarily in most households. And in a lot of cases here, their husbands aren't there. They're off in war. So they're the ones who are responsible for procuring food, for bringing it back. And they've also been, in some ways, empowered by the war, not just because they've become the heads of household in the absence of the men in the family, but because, again, prefiguring World War I and World War II, in the absence of men, women are going to work in factories and going to do waged work outside of the home. And all of that leads to a kind of independence and political empowerment that is also going to be expressed through these riots.
I mean, this is Gone with the Wind, totally.
Isn't it just totally? I was like, don't mention terror.
I know, but that's all I can think of when, like, Scarlett is, like, scrummaging for a potato or something like that in her field. But one of the things, though, that I think also makes this really difficult is that because women are sort of holding down the fort, so to speak, there is a huge munitions facility that has an explosion. And in that explosion, you have dozens of mostly women and young girls that are killed. And as a result of this deadly explosion, their deaths are sort of seen as expendable. And I think that rubs the morale of the women who are there the wrong way. It's like, oh, there are poor people and then there are worthy poor people. There are the ways we think about sort of like who gets to eat and who doesn't. And that spurs people to the point of rage.
Yeah.
It's sort of overdetermined by the time the women come forward at the beginning of April. So at the beginning of April, led by two women, Mary Jackson and Minerva Meredith, a group of these female workers that we were just talking about, and wives, they meet and they decide, we're going to go to the governor. Like, something has to change. Something has to be done. And the governor who lives here in Richmond, John Letcher, is going to be the guy who does it. Now, Letcher's an interesting name, but
yes, it is.
Anyway, so that request for a meeting is the sort of first organizational drive. And Letcher says no. And that's when the riots begin.
Yeah. And they start screaming out, bread or blood. Bread or blood.
Wow.
And I'm like, snap. Better get them some bread, stat.
So the women, as we say, are rightfully angered at this point. They do come to this meeting with Letcher with reportedly arms and knives. And so maybe I kind of understand why Letcher was like, maybe I'm not going to take this meeting. Is that a knife in your pocket? But yes, it immediately, angers folks. The riots coalesce. Thousands of people are now out in the street. One quick note, I'm just a big fan of people who have two first names, and Minerva Meredith is a very rare example of that, but I just want to highlight Minerva Meredith.
Fantastic.
Great, two first names. But we now have these riots breaking out into the streets, thousands of people gathering, led by these two women, chanting bread or blood. They start to attack government warehouses, grocery stores, other establishments. They're seizing food, clothing, wagons, jewelry, other goods.
This might be called looting if it was a different demographic.
Exactly. Yeah.
I was like, there's no difference. That's what it is.
Oh, they got jewelry and luxury goods too? They couldn't eat those.
Yeah, I know.
Exactly. And so how does the Confederacy respond in this moment?
Well, it's interesting because Jefferson Davis, who's the president of the Confederacy, shows up and tries to disperse the crowd and sort of get, the women to go back home. And
weren't you just fasting and praying just 5 days ago? What happened? I had this great idea.
It didn't take.
And it's not a good look when you have to call troops in on your own people. And that's essentially what they have to do. They have to bring in the troops to threaten to fire on the mob to get them to disperse. Now, it only lasts like a couple hours, but it's a huge blow to the Confederacy for sure.
Hey, our Radiotopia colleagues, the Kitchen Sisters, have a new episode I think you'll want to check out. It's called Buildings Speak, Stories of Pioneering Women Architects, hosted by Frances McDormand. Trailblazers, groundbreakers, skyscraper visionaries, little-known stories of Julia Morgan, Natalie DeBlois, Amazalie Meredith, women who changed the skyline and the built environment that surrounds us today. Listen to the Kitchen Sisters present everywhere you find podcasts and at kitchensisters.org.
There's also this kind of amazing moment prior to the troops being deployed where the mayor of Richmond, Joseph Mayo, also a good name, literally reads them the Riot Act. This is part of English common law, the idea that there is a literal act called a Riot Act, and the way that you invoke it is to read it to the crowd. It's sort of like giving them, you know how police now, you say, we're giving you 15 minutes to disperse, otherwise we'll declare this an unlawful assembly. That's essentially what it is. But that idea of reading the Riot Act is what the mayor does. And they're just like, try your best. Come for us. Yeah.
You have words. We have knives and clubs.
we have an axe, so we're fine.
So aftermath here. So the riot only lasts about 2 hours. 60 men and women are arrested and tried. Many end up being pardoned, in part because just the jail couldn't hold or feed them, ironically enough, and so they had to be let out. In the aftermath of this, I think there are some efforts to, just at a pure sort of calculus of like, we need to feed people a little bit more. There are some efforts to improve that, but I'm so fascinated by the fact that, Kellie, you hinted at it, but like this idea of the worthy poor and the unworthy poor really emerges in this moment to the point where, and this blows my mind, but there were like special markets that were set up by the city where only the meritorious poor, which is the phrase used, could obtain provisions and fuel at slightly reduced prices. I can't imagine that mollified folks too much.
I mean, this is the thing. If you are going to war to preserve slavery, right, then the chances that life could be good for you as a poor white person just don't hold any bearing. And I think that's what you see, is that you have this sort of hierarchy between women who are either slaveholders or women who are propertied or women who have resources and those who don't. And those who don't are treated as expendable or are given, sort of like they have to pay a higher tax. It's the same thing when I think about what is the riot that took place in New York City that was the
draft riots?
The draft riots, yeah. Where it's like if you can pay, for someone to sort of fight in your stead, then you don't have to go to war. But if you have no money, well, then sign you up. And that's sort of like, rich man's war and a poor man's fight is what plays out in the streets.
Yeah.
It's also just food is a basic human necessity. It doesn't matter the quality of person you are. The quality of your starvation is the same. And that idea that like we only owe it to people who meet a certain definition of merit to give them food or sell them food.
Right.
It's bad.
Yeah.
It's morally, ethically just wrong.
Yeah. A couple more things. One, no surprise, news of this played really well in the North, right? There's reportedly the Secretary of War for the Confederacy, James Seddon, tried to implore the press to not cover this and not write about this because it would be used as propaganda. That didn't work. Word got out. The North loved this moment.
New York Times runs with it.
For sure.
Front page story.
For sure. And, the other thing I'll just say is there is a plaque. So if anyone here is listening from Richmond and wants to walk over and snap a picture of the plaque for the Richmond bread riot, it is out there and sort of, I think, tells a pretty decent story of how this all went down. I just want to end by coming back to I think the first thing you said, Kellie, in this episode, which is just war is hell. And as much as we cast the Civil War in these big and I think pretty obvious moral terms, for the vast majority of people, it was hell on both sides. And I think it's important to remember that, like, and it's a reminder now as we sort of live in a world, with a lot of war, of just the fallout for regular people just trying to live their lives day to day. And I think the story really brings a lot of that to life. All right. Well, we will leave it there. Let's do a couple of these also on this day's other things that happened on April 2nd throughout the years. These are the kinds of things we're also highlighting in our newsletter, by the way, if you want to sign up at thisdaypod.com. But in 1792, Congress passed the Coinage Act, which established the U.S. Mint.
And also on this day in 1865, to commemorate the bread riots and because Union forces were knocking on their door, Confederate President Jefferson Davis and most of his cabinet flee the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia.
Just 2 years later, right? Richmond finally gets evacuated. But, I love doing these also on this days because you see these sort of cycles, and I just feel that's the picture to paint. And Kellie, you pointed out, but it's like we're coming off a long, hard winter, and now we're seeing in the spring, like, what is the reality in front of us, right? And I think that's part of what happens in this moment.
Yeah. In 1912, the just completed RMS Titanic left Belfast to begin its sea trials 8 days before the start of the ill-fated maiden voyage. I love this.
Yeah, I was going to say, you're a big Titanic head, so.
Kellie's has done some research on the Titanic. Shout out to The Rest is History, my favorite history podcast at the moment. Just did a 6-part series on the Titanic, I think. That was really fascinating.
Here for it.
Yeah, and got into a lot of misconceptions about the thing, and also about how it's just kind of the perfect story to wrap up all of the political and economic and racial and class threads of that era. 1917, April 2nd, Woodrow Wilson asks Congress to declare war against Germany, saying, quote, "The world must be made safe for democracy," and Congress declares war 4 days later. They didn't call it World War I then, folks. They only called it World War I when there was, just a world war. All right.
Oh, boy.
We will leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia from PRX.